Emily Carter's hands were still shaking when the door swung open. Not from the cold. Not from the weight of the pie tin she'd carried across the frostbitten road for 20 minutes straight. She was shaking because the man standing in that doorway, tall, dark-eyed jaw carved like old oak, a quietness about him that felt like something she already knew was not a stranger. She knew that handwriting. She knew those words. She'd pressed his last letter against her chest in the dark and cried herself to sleep. He was Daniel. Her Daniel. And he had absolutely no idea who she was. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at something in your chest, please hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that doorway. Let's go back to Emily Carter and the pie that changed everything. The pie had been Thomas's favorite. That was the first thing Emily thought about when she pulled it from the oven that morning. Not the new neighbor, not the smoke she'd seen rising from the old Cowboy place 2 nights ago, not the fact that someone had finally moved into that drafty house across the road after 3 years of it sitting empty and cold. She thought about Thomas. She thought about how he used to lean in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and his eyes half closed, breathing in the smell of brown sugar and cinnamon, like it was something holy. How he'd say every single time without fail, "Emmy, if I die before you, I want you to bake that pie at my funeral." And she'd always laughed. She'd always said, "You're not going anywhere, you old fool." And he'd always smiled like he wasn't so sure. He hadn't been wrong to doubt. Thomas Carter died on a Wednesday in October 14 months ago from a heart that gave out without a single word of warning. He was 41 years old. He was hanging a new door on the barn. He was alive and then he wasn't, and the world just kept right on going like nothing had been ripped out of the center of it. Emily had baked the pie at his funeral. She'd done exactly what he asked. She hadn't baked one since. Not until this morning. She stood at the edge of her porch now, the tin wrapped in a clean dish towel, the steam still rising into the October air, and she told herself this was just neighborly. This was just what people in Willow Creek did. You brought food, you said welcome, you went back home. You didn't stand on your own porch having a conversation with yourself about a dead man's favorite dessert. She stepped off the porch and started across the road. The Calloway place looked different with smoke coming out of the chimney. It looked less like an old wound and more like a house again. And Emily wasn't sure how she felt about that. She'd spent 3 years watching it sit empty, watching the weeds grow up around the fence posts, watching the shutters go gray and loose. There was something almost comforting in that, the way an empty house could hold grief the same way she did. Quiet. Still. Waiting for something it wasn't ever sure was coming. She knocked. She heard boots on floorboards. Heavy, unhurried. The kind of walk that belonged to a man who'd been in no particular hurry for a long time. The door opened, and Emily Carter's entire world came to a stop. He was tall, dark-haired with eyes so dark brown they were almost black in the shade of the doorway. He had a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days, and he was wearing a plain linen shirt rolled to the elbows, suspenders loose over his shoulders like she'd caught him mid-task. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he wasn't expecting. Not unkind, just careful, just measuring. And she knew him. Not his face. She had never seen his face. She knew the way he held himself, something in the set of his shoulders, the way he didn't fill a doorway with noise, just presence. She knew the shape of the quiet around him. She had spent 8 months reading words written by a man who stood exactly like this, and some part of her brain, some part that had been paying attention without her permission, recognized it the way you recognize a voice you haven't heard in years. "Ma'am," he said, low and careful. "Help you with something." Emily opened her mouth. She closed it. She started, stopped. "I brought a pie." He looked at the dish towel in her hands, then back at her face. "That's kind," he said. "You the neighbor." "Across the road," she managed. Emily Carter." He was quiet for just a second too long. Just one beat past comfortable. "Daniel Hayes," he said. And there it was. Emily felt it move through her like cold water. A slow, spreading thing starting somewhere behind her ribs and radiating outward until her fingers went numb around the pie tin. She heard the name the way you hear something in a dream right before you wake up. She heard it, and she knew it, and she could not for the life of her make a single muscle in her face behave the way it was supposed to. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. The word came out wrong, too fast, too bright, like something that had been waiting behind a door that got open too quick. "Yes, I'm fine. It's warm. The pie, it just came out of the oven." He looked at her for a moment with those dark, careful eyes, and she had the terrifying sensation that he was reading her the same way she had spent 8 months reading him slowly, without hurry, not missing much. "You want to come in?" he asked. "No," she said. "No, I shouldn't. I've got bread proofing. I just wanted to say welcome to the neighborhood." She held out the pie. He took it from her with both hands, careful about it the way a man handles something he's been told is fragile without being told why. His fingers were close to hers for just a moment, not touching, just close, and Emily stepped back like she'd been burned. "Thank you, Miss Emily," he said. "Mrs. P," she said before she could stop herself. "Mrs. Carter, my husband passed last year. It's Mrs." She had no idea why she'd said that. She had no idea what was wrong with her. Something moved across Daniel Hayes's face. Not pity. She'd had enough pity to last 3 lifetimes, and she knew what it looked like, and this wasn't it. It was something quieter than that. Something that recognized something. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. She nodded. She turned around. She walked back across the road with her arms empty and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her ears, and she did not look back until she was on her own porch with her hand on her own door, and when she did look back, the Calloway place. Daniel's place was quiet again, and the door was closed, and the smoke kept rising from the chimney like nothing in the world had changed. She went inside. She sat down at the kitchen table. She pressed both palms flat against the wood and stared at them. Daniel Hayes. She had written him 31 letters. He had written her 28. It had started like most things in Emily's life after Thomas, out of sheer desperation, dressed up as practicality. She didn't call it loneliness. She was very careful not to call it that. She called it correspondence. She called it a small human exchange to fill the quieter hours of the week. She called it a practical decision made by a sensible woman who happened to have time in the evenings after the baking was done and the accounts were settled, and the house was as clean as it was going to get. The advertisement had been in the back of the Willow Creek Gazette, between a notice for a lost roan mare and a listing for someone selling a second-hand plow. 3 lines, barely readable. Seeking letter companionship. No obligation. No expectation. Only honesty. Write to D. Hayes, General Post, Denver, CO. She had read it 4 times. Looked away. Come back to it, looked away again, and then cut it out of the paper with her kitchen shears and folded it into her apron pocket, where it sat for 9 days before she finally, at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, sat down at the kitchen table and wrote her first letter. She had introduced herself as Emily, just Emily, a baker in a small town, a widow, a woman who was not looking for anything except maybe a reason to write a sentence that wasn't a grocery list or a bread order. His reply had taken 3 weeks. She'd assumed he wasn't going to write back. She'd made peace with it. Then the letter arrived. His handwriting was careful. Not fancy. No man who introduced himself the way Daniel Hayes introduced himself had ever been taught to write with flourish. He said he was a former ranch hand, drifting between work, not much of a talker, but apparently not bad at writing. He said he'd seen the loneliness in her letter, clear as daylight, and he appreciated that she hadn't tried to dress it up. He said that was the main thing. He was tired of dressing things up. Emily had read that letter 6 times. Then she'd written back the same night. The second letter was longer on both sides. The third longer still. By the 5th exchange, they had stopped being careful about what they said. The way you stop being careful with someone once you realize they're not going to use what you give them against you. She told him about Thomas. about the barn door, about how she'd been standing in the kitchen making biscuit dough when she heard the sound of him falling, and how she'd known before she even got to the door, had known in the way you sometimes know terrible things before your mind is ready to admit them. She told him about the months after, how the grief wasn't loud the way people seem to expect, wasn't weeping at the dinner table. It was just silence. It was just the absence of someone's boots by the door, and someone's coffee cup on the left side of the rack, and someone's particular way of breathing in the room next to hers. He told her about a woman named Clara. He didn't say much about what happened, just that they'd been planning to marry, and then they weren't. And that was a kind of loss too, even if it didn't come with a funeral. He said grief didn't need a death certificate to be real. He said he'd learned that the hard way. She had cried reading that one. Not for herself, for him. And that had surprised her. She hadn't had enough left in her for a long time to cry for anyone who wasn't Thomas. Their letters were not romantic. That was the thing she kept telling herself through all 8 months of them. They were honest. They were two people who had been badly damaged, talking to each other across the distance of several hundred miles, without any of the performance that came with face-to-face human exchange. No one had to hold themselves together in a letter. No one had to smile when they were crumbling. You could write the truth at 10 o'clock at night and fold it away and let someone else read it in their own time, in their own quiet. And that was safe in a way that nothing else had felt safe since the October morning the whole shape of Emily's life went wrong. She had told herself every time she sat down to write that she was not in love with Daniel Hayes. She had told herself that with some regularity in the last few months. She told herself that now, sitting at her kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, staring at nothing. She was not in love with a man she had never met. The fact that she had now met him, and that he lived directly across the road, and that he was exactly as his letters had made him seem, quiet and careful, and unhurried and real in a way that most people were not, was not relevant to the statement she was making to herself, which was that she was not in love with Daniel Hayes. She got up. She started a fresh loaf of bread. She needed something to do with her hands. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about his voice, low and careful, like a man who chose his words slowly and put them down gently, the way you'd put down something that could break. She'd heard that in his letters. She'd heard the carefulness. She hadn't expected to hear it in actual sound coming out of an actual throat from behind an actual face. She should have told him. That was the thought that kept circling. She should have said right there in the doorway with the pie between them and the steam still rising, she should have said, "I wrote you a letter in February, and March, and April and May and June. I told you things I have never said out loud to a living soul." She hadn't said any of it. Instead, she'd blurted out that she was a widow and walked away, and now she had to figure out what to do with the fact that the man she'd been corresponding with for 8 months, the man who knew about Thomas's barn door and the biscuit dough and the particular shape of the silence in a house after a person leaves, it was living 40 yards from her front door. She could write him a letter. The thought arrived with a strange, almost hysterical edge to it. She could write him a letter and explain the whole situation calmly and rationally from a distance of 40 yards. Or she could simply never speak to him again and sell the house and move somewhere he wasn't. Both options seemed equally reasonable at 2 in the morning. She saw him again the next day. She hadn't planned it. She'd gone out to check the fence along the east side of her garden. 2 of the posts had gone soft, and she needed to see how bad it was before the first real freeze came and made everything worse. And she'd looked up, and there he was on the far side of the road doing something to the hinges on the old Callaway gate. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He lifted a hand. Not a wave exactly, more like an acknowledgement. "I see you. I'm not going to make more of it than that." She did the same. Then she looked back down at her fence posts and willed her face to do something normal. She heard his boots on the road about 30 seconds later. "Miss Emily," he said. "Mrs." She said automatically, and then wanted to put her head directly into the soft dirt. "Mrs. Carter." He stopped at the edge of her property line and looked at the fence posts. "Those are bad," he said. "I know. You got replacement posts? I have some wood in the shed. I haven't gotten around to it. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at the posts, not at her, which made it slightly easier to breathe. I can help with that, he said. If you want. Got nothing pressing this afternoon. She should have said no. She had a whole catalog of reasons to say no, starting with, I am currently suffering a minor emotional crisis related to your identity, and ending with this is a terrible idea for reasons I cannot explain without making everything catastrophic. That would be very kind, she heard herself say instead. He nodded. Hour or so. Let me finish with the gate. He went back across the road. Emily stood very still for a moment, then went inside to get more coffee because she was going to need it. He worked the way she had expected him to, unhurried, methodical, without any unnecessary sound. He didn't talk while he worked. She'd known that about him, actually. He'd written once that he'd spent enough years around men who filled silences with noise just to prove they were there, and that he'd learned to tell the difference between quiet, that was comfortable, and quiet that was afraid. He said he preferred the first kind. She worked alongside him, holding posts while he set them, handing him tools when he reached, and they fell into a rhythm that was strange and familiar in equal measure. Strange because they were strangers, at least in the way strangers were supposed to be strangers, and familiar because they weren't, not really, not to her. You've been baking long? He asked after a while. Since I was 9, she said. My grandmother taught me. She said a woman who could bake well would never be entirely without options. Something shifted around the corners of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape that comes before one. Smart woman, he said. She was. Meaner than a March storm, but smart. He laughed at that, a short, real sound, more surprised than polished. Emily felt it hit her somewhere in the chest. You sell or just bake for yourself? He asked. I sell. I take orders mostly. Some to the general store. Mrs. Aldridge lets me use a corner of her display counter on Fridays. It's not what Thomas and I planned for the property. We were going to have more cattle, expand the land. But after I needed something that was mine, that I could run myself, and I'm better at bread than I am at cattle. She hadn't meant to say that much. It came out like it always did, with him just falling out of her, like it had been waiting for a place to land. He didn't make it uncomfortable. He just set the next post and said, That takes something, starting over by yourself. It takes not having any other choice, she said. He looked at her then, just for a moment, steady and even. That counts too, he said. They finished the fence in silence. When it was done, Emily stood back and looked at the line of new posts, solid and square in the October ground, and she had the strangest feeling, warm and aching at the same time, the way you feel when something good happens and the person you most want to tell about it isn't there. Thank you, she said. I'd offer you pie, but you already have the last one I made. It was a good pie, he said. Apple's not hard, the crust is the whole game. It was a good crust too. She looked at him. He was looking at the fence. The late afternoon light was doing something complicated to the planes of his face. And Emily Carter, who had not done a single reckless thing in 14 months, thought, he's going to find out eventually. Mr. Hayes, she said. Daniel's fine. Daniel! She stopped. Started again. Are you still writing letters to the correspondence? The ad you placed? He went still, just slightly, just enough. No, he said. After a moment, I've been moving around. Hard to keep a post address. Right, she said. Yes, of course. He looked at her then, and she looked back, and she had the dizzying feeling that he was almost there, almost at the edge of something, and that if she just waited one more second. Well, he said, I should get back. Yes, she said. Thank you. For the fence. Anytime, Mrs. Carter. He walked back across the road. Emily watched him go. Then she went inside and stood in the middle of her kitchen and pressed her hands against her face and breathed. She had 31 letters in a box under her bed. He had written 28 of them. He had told her in letter number 19 that the thing he missed most about having someone in his life was the way a house sounded different when there was another person in it. He had told her that a silent house sounds like a held breath. He had told her that he'd been holding his breath for 3 years, and he was getting tired. She had read that letter so many times, the fold lines were going white. He was 40 yards away. He had fixed her fence. He had laughed at her grandmother joke. He had no idea. Emily Carter was not in love with Daniel Hayes. She was also, with growing certainty, a very bad liar. She wrote him a letter that night. She didn't mean to. She sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and she pulled out a piece of paper the same way she always had, without thinking too hard about it, because thinking too hard about it always made her stop, and she wrote, "Not about the fence, not about the afternoon." She wrote about the apple blossoms that had come in late this year, how the tree in her yard had held out until almost November, before it finally let go, and how she'd always thought that was either stubbornness or hope, and she could never decide which. She folded it. She addressed it to D. Hayes General Post, Denver, Colorado. Then she sat and looked at it for a long time. He wasn't in Denver. He was 40 yards away. He was probably sitting by a fire right now in the house that used to be the Calloway place, and he had no idea that the woman who'd handed him an apple pie 2 days ago had been writing to him since February. Emily picked up the letter and put it in the box under her bed with all the others. She needed to tell him. She understood that clearly. The longer she waited, the worse it was going to be. That was simple arithmetic. Every day that passed without him knowing was another day she was carrying something he had a right to know, and she'd never been the kind of woman who was comfortable with that weight. Thomas used to say she was constitutionally incapable of keeping a secret from someone who mattered. He'd said it like it was a flaw. She'd thought at the time he was probably right. She turned out the lamp and went to bed and told herself she would tell Daniel Hayes tomorrow. She did not tell Daniel Hayes tomorrow. She didn't see him at all for 4 days, which should have been a relief, and was instead a specific kind of torment she didn't have a proper name for. She baked. She filled her Friday orders. She delivered 24 dinner rolls to Mrs. Aldridge's store and listened to the woman talk for 20 minutes about the new school teacher and whether the Perkins boy was ever going to fix his roof, and she smiled and nodded and thought about nothing but the smoke rising from the chimney across the road. On the 5th day, she was standing at her front window at 6 in the morning with her coffee the way she always did, and she watched Daniel come out of his door in the gray early light, pull on his jacket, and head toward the road. He stopped at the edge of it. He looked at her house. Emily stepped back from the window so fast she sloshed coffee on her wrist. She heard his boots on the porch steps 30 seconds later. She heard him knock. She put down her cup. She wiped her hands on her apron. She opened the door. He was holding a brown paper package tied with twine. He held it out without preamble. "Caught a brace of pheasants yesterday," he said. "More than I can eat. Thought you might use them." Emily looked at the package, then at him. He was watching her with that particular steadiness of his, the kind that felt like it went right through the polite surface of a conversation and landed somewhere more honest. "Thank you," she said. Yes, thank you. You know how to dress them, or you want me to?" "I know how to dress them," she said, maybe a little too quickly. Something in his expression said he'd noticed. "Right, of course." An uncomfortable silence opened up between them. Emily felt it pressing on her sternum. He had his hands in his pockets now, which meant he wasn't leaving yet, and she had her hand on the door, which meant she was still deciding whether to let this become a conversation or end it cleanly. Her mouth made the decision without consulting her. "Do you want coffee?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I don't want to impose. You just brought me 2 pheasants. It's coffee. Come in." Tongue. He sat at her kitchen table the same way he did everything without fuss, without taking up more space than he needed. He looked at the room the way a careful man looks at a place that belongs to someone else, not with judgment, just with attention. His eyes moved to the shelf where she kept the bread tins, to the hook by the back door, where the aprons hung, to the table itself, solid oak, older than both of them, worn smooth in the places where hands had rested against it for years. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 8 years. Thomas and I moved here when we married. The house was his grandmother's. She poured the coffee. You. Just the last few weeks. Got the place from a man named Calloway who decided Colorado winters weren't worth the beauty. They're not, Emily said. I say that every year in February and then forget by April. Why do you stay? She set his cup in front of him. She sat down across the table. Because it's mine, she said. Because Thomas and I built something here, and leaving would be... She stopped, looked at her coffee. It'd feel like letting go of the last part of him I've got left. And I'm not ready for that. Daniel said nothing for a moment. He turned the cup in his hand slow. That's honest, he said. I don't see much point in anything else. He looked up at her then, directly. No, he said. Neither do I. She felt it again, that sensation of almost, of being right at the edge of something. The kitchen felt too small. The morning light was coming through the window and landing across the table between them, and it was all so ordinary that it was almost unbearable. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. The ad you placed in the paper, the correspondence. She kept her voice even, careful. Did it? Help, whatever you were looking for. Did you find it? He was still for a moment. Not the kind of still that meant nothing, the kind that meant he was deciding how much to give. More than I expected, he said. Yeah. What were you looking for? Someone to talk to. Someone who wasn't... He stopped. Set down the cup. I'd been moving for a long time. 3 years. After Clara. And when you move like that, you start to lose track of yourself a little. Because there's no one around long enough to reflect you back. You stop knowing what you actually think, because there's nobody to think at. He looked at her steadily. The letters helped with that. Emily's heart was doing something very unreasonable. The person you wrote to, she said. What was she like? His eyes sharpened. Just slightly. Just enough that her stomach dropped. Sharp, he said. Practical. Funny when she wasn't trying to be. Said hard things simply without needing you to make a fuss about them. He paused. She was carrying something heavy, and she did it quietly. I respected that. Emily wrapped both hands around her cup and said very carefully, It sounds like you knew her well. Better than I know most people I've actually met, he said. Which is a strange thing to say about someone whose face you've never seen. The word face landed in the room like a stone into water. Emily looked at him. He was looking at her with something in his expression she couldn't quite read, not yet, at the edge of understanding, but closer than she was comfortable with. She thought, this is the moment. Right now. Say it. She said, More coffee. He looked at his cup, which was still 3/4 full. Sure, he said. She got up. She filled both cups. She sat back down. The moment had passed, or she had let it pass, and she wasn't sure which one was true, and she was aware that either way, she was behaving in a manner that Thomas would have called chicken-hearted, which was the word he used when he was too fond of her to say coward outright. I used to write letters, she said. During the correspondence period, I answered an ad, not yours, another one. A woman in Kansas initially. Then later. She stopped, steadied herself. It helped me too. Putting things down on paper, Daniel said. Having someone read them, she said. It's different. It's not the same as talking. There's no face to manage. You can't see someone's reaction when you say something hard, so you just say it. And then it's done. It's out there. And you wait. And someone writes back. And someone writes back, she agreed. He was watching her in a way that made her feel transparent. Not in a bad way. In the way that terrified her because it was the same way she'd felt reading his letters known. Without performance. Without the careful management of how you appeared to the people around you. Just known. Emily, he said, and the sound of her name in his voice, not Mrs. Carter, just her name, plain and direct, made her breath go short. Is there something you want to tell me? She looked at him across the oak table in the morning light. Her hands were perfectly steady. She thought that was strange. She thought she should be shaking the way she'd been shaking at the door 3 days ago, but she wasn't, because something in her had gone very quiet and very still, the way things do right before they break. "Not yet," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded just once and reached for his coffee. "All right," he said, and somehow in the specific, impossible way of him, that was enough. He didn't push. He didn't ask again. He just sat with her in the kitchen in the morning light and drank his coffee, and the silence between them was exactly the kind he'd written about. The first kind, the comfortable kind. Emily hated how much she loved that. So, the problem, she told Ruth Hadley 3 days later, was that she'd dug herself into something she had no clean way out of. Ruth was her closest friend in Willow Creek, 62 years old, sharp as a thumbnail tack, with the kind of face that looked like it had heard everything twice, and wasn't surprised by any of it. She ran the post office, which was both coincidence and deeply unhelpful. "You're telling me," Ruth said slowly from across her kitchen table, "that the man you've been writing letters to for 8 months has moved into the Calloway house?" "Yes." "And he doesn't know it was you?" "No." "And you've had coffee with him?" "Once." Ruth put down her spoon. She looked at Emily the way a doctor looks at a patient who's described a symptoms list that makes no logical sense. "Emily Ann Carter," she said. "What in the world are you waiting for? I don't know how to tell him without it being—" Emily pressed her palms to the table. "He's going to feel ambushed. He moved here. He doesn't know anyone. And now I'm supposed to say, 'By the way, I've been reading your private thoughts for 8 months, and I live 40 yards from your front door.'" "Yes," Ruth said. "Exactly that. Those exact words." "Ruth," Emily. "Listen to me." Ruth leaned forward. "That man wrote you letters about the deepest parts of himself. He told you about Clara. He told you about the silence. He wrote you 28 letters, which I know because I sorted every single one of them myself." She paused pointedly. "And now God or fate or whatever you want to call it has put him across the road from you, and you are sitting here in my kitchen worrying about how to word it." "How to word it matters," Emily said. "You know what matters more, that you're running out of time to say it at all. Every day you wait, it gets worse. Because what does it look like if he finds out from someone else? What does it look like if he finds out you knew the whole time?" Emily went quiet. That was the thing she hadn't let herself think about directly. The shape of it had been circling at the edge of everything, but she'd been careful not to look at it straight on. What it would look like. How it would sound. She knew. She looked me in the face every day, and she knew, and she said nothing. "How does someone find out something like that?" she said mostly to herself. "In a town of 300 people, Ruth said. "Emily. He went to Mrs. Aldridge's store yesterday and bought supplies. Mrs. Aldridge, who sees your Friday display every single week. Mrs. Aldridge, who has asked me more than once why you look happier after you check your mail." She raised an eyebrow. "You tell me how long that takes." Emily felt the bottom of her stomach drop out. "She doesn't know. She doesn't know yet," Ruth said. "Yet. Go tell that man the truth before someone else tells him a version of it that makes you look dishonest when you're not." She was still turning that over when she got home. She went straight to the box under the bed. She pulled out all 28 of his letters and stacked them on the kitchen table. She stacked her 31 next to them, the ones she'd never sent, the ones she'd written after he stopped having a mailing address. The ones that were just her talking to him in the dark, because she'd needed somewhere to put what she was carrying. She looked at all of it. 59 letters. 8 months of two people being more honest with each other than they'd been with anyone in years. She picked up the one from April, the one she'd read the most, the one where he'd written about the held breath house and the 3 years of being tired, and she read it one more time, standing in the kitchen, and when she got to the last line, "I reckon being tired is just the body's way of admitting it wants something different. I just ain't figured out yet what different looks like." She folded it carefully and put it back in the box. She put her coat on. She crossed the road. She knocked on his door. He answered faster this time, like he'd been closer to it, or maybe like he'd been expecting someone. He looked at her face, and something in him shifted. Immediately went from neutral to attentive, the same way it had in the letters whenever she'd written something that was actually true. "Emily," he said. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "And I should have said it before now. I'm sorry it took me this long." He stepped back from the door without a word. She walked in. She stood in the middle of his front room, sparse functional, a few things he'd unpacked, and a lot of things he hadn't, and she turned to face him and she said it. "I wrote to you. I answered your ad. In February. I've been writing to you for 8 months, and when you opened that door last week, I recognized you. Not your face. I'd never seen your face. I recognized you. The way you stand. The way you go quiet. The way you—" Her voice did something she hadn't given it permission to do, and she stopped, pressed forward. "I have 31 letters in a box under my bed, and the last 10 I never sent because you didn't have a mailing address anymore. And I know that I know how this sounds. But I needed you to hear it from me, because you deserve to hear it from me, and I am so sorry I didn't say it sooner." The room was completely silent. Daniel Hayes looked at her for a long time. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His face was doing something she couldn't read, and she stood there in the middle of his half-unpacked front room and let him look because whatever was coming, she'd earned it. "Emily," he said finally, and his voice was very careful, very quiet. "Yes." "The tree in your yard," he said. "The one you wrote about in October. The one that held its blossoms too long." She felt the air go out of her. "Yes," she whispered. "You said you couldn't decide if it was stubbornness or hope." She couldn't speak at all. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met his face, the carefulness fell away from his expression. Not all of it just enough, and underneath it was something wide open and almost frightened and completely devastatingly real. "I wrote back to that one," he said. "I wrote you a letter the same night I read it. I never sent it either." The silence after those words was the loudest thing Emily Carter had ever stood inside of. He had written her back. He had read the letter about the apple blossom tree, the one she'd written at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night with cold tea and a lamp that needed its wick trimmed, the one she'd almost thrown away 3 times before she folded it and addressed it. And he had sat down and written back, and he hadn't sent it either. She didn't know what to do with that. Her brain was turning it over like a stone it couldn't quite get its hands around. "You never sent it," she said. "No." He moved to his desk in the corner of the room, plain functional, shoved against the wall with a stack of papers on it, and he pulled open the top drawer. He took out a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her without crossing the room, like he was letting her decide whether to come and take it. She crossed the room. She took it. She unfolded it. His handwriting, the handwriting she knew better than most people's faces, looked back at her, and she had to breathe through her nose for a moment before the words stopped swimming. "Emily, I reckon hope and stubbornness are the same thing wearing different coats. A tree that holds on past its season isn't confused. It just ain't ready to let go. I understand that better than I ought to. D." She stood there reading it 3 times. Then she folded it back along the same lines and held it in both hands. "Why didn't you send it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. His arms were crossed, not defensive, more like he needed something to hold himself together while he thought. "Because it felt like too much," he said. "We'd been writing for months, and I could feel it changing. What it was, what I wanted it to be, and I didn't know how to. I'd already lost Clara by wanting something more than she was offering. I wasn't ready to do that again through the mail." Emily looked at him. "So you just stopped?" "I stopped writing to the address," he said. "I didn't stop." He stopped himself, looked at the floor. "I wrote 4 more letters, never sent any of them." Something cracked open in the middle of Emily's chest, clean and sharp like the first split of firewood. "I wrote 10, she said. He looked up at her. "After the address stopped working," she said. "I wrote 10 more. They're in the box with the others. I knew no one was going to read them. I wrote them anyway because by that point I didn't know how to stop." Neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched out long enough to become its own kind of answer. "This is the strangest situation I have ever been in," Daniel said, and his voice was so flat and honest about it that Emily laughed a real laugh, short and startled, the kind that comes out before you can weigh it. He looked at her like that laugh had done something to him, like he wasn't sure what to do with the fact that it had. "Agreed," she said. "What do we do now?" he asked. "I have no earthly idea," she said. "But I'm very glad I told you." "So am I," he said, quietly, without drama. Just that "so am I," and it landed in the room with all the weight of 28 letters. She went home an hour later with his unsent letter still in her coat pocket. He hadn't asked for it back, and she hadn't offered it, and neither of them had mentioned it, which she thought said something real about both of them. She didn't sleep, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than before. Before had been tangled and anxious, full of wrong turns. This was just wide, like a room with all the furniture rearranged, and she was learning to walk through it in the dark without running into things. She was learning. That was the word that kept circling. Learning. 3 days after she told him the truth, Daniel knocked on her door at 7 in the morning and asked if she wanted help moving the rest of the winter stores into the root cellar. She said yes. They worked for 2 hours moving sacks and jars and crates, and he didn't bring up the letters, and she didn't bring up the letters. And the strange thing was that the silence wasn't awkward. It was the same silence from the kitchen, the first kind, the comfortable kind. Except now it had something in it she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt present. She felt like she was actually inside the morning, instead of watching it happen from somewhere behind her own eyes. "You're different today," Ruth said when Emily came by the post office that afternoon. "I told him," Emily said. Ruth put down the envelope she was sorting. And he'd written back to the apple blossom letter. He'd kept it in his desk drawer. Ruth stared at her for a full 4 seconds. "Emily Carter," she said, "I need you to understand that I have worked in this post office for 22 years, and I have never not once heard a story like that. I know. That man is in love with you." Ruth. He moved the unsent letter across 3 states, Emily, in a desk drawer. That is not something a man does by accident. Emily pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment. "We don't know each other," she said. "Not like that. We know letters. Letters aren't... It's not the same as a person." "No," Ruth said. "It's not. It's harder. Because when you write, you can't hide. And that man has been reading you without walls for 8 months." She picked her envelope back up. "You're not strangers. You're 2 people who haven't been in the same room yet. That's different." Emily thought about that all the way home. The first real argument happened 2 weeks later, and it was her fault. She had taken on 3 extra orders for the weekend, a wedding in town, a church supper, a standing delivery to the Hadley farm, and she'd underestimated the time, the way she always did when she was trying to outrun something with work. By Friday afternoon, she had 2 batches burning, and a delivery she'd promised at 4 o'clock, and absolutely no way to make all of it happen. Daniel had come by at 3:30 to return her pie tin. "You look like a woman who's about to start throwing things," he said. "I am not going to throw anything," she said in a voice that suggested the threshold was closer than she was admitting. "What's the order?" She explained it. He looked at the table at the oven at the clock on the wall. He said, "I can take the Hadley delivery. I know where the farm is." "I don't need..." "Emily, you're not my..." She stopped. "You're not responsible for my mistakes." "I know that," he said. "I'm offering to help because it's a practical problem with a practical solution, and there's no point standing on ceremony about it when you've got bread in the oven." She looked at him. He looked back, steady and unhurried, completely unruffled by the fact that she'd almost said something that would have required both of them to define things neither of them was ready to define. "Fine," she said. "The address is on the slip by the door. Tell Mrs. Hadley the sourdough needs another hour before she cuts it." He took the slip. He took the basket. He left without making anything out of any of it. She stood at the oven with her heart hammering for reasons that had nothing to do with the burned bread. He was back by 5. He reported that Mrs. Hadley had sent back a jar of blackberry preserves and a message that Emily Carter was the finest baker in the county and possibly the state, which he delivered with such straight-faced gravity that Emily had to turn away to hide the smile. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. You keep doing things you don't have to do." "I reckon that's true of most things worth doing," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was leaning in the doorway, the same doorway she'd first seen him fill that first morning with the pie between them, and the late light was behind him, and he looked so exactly like the man she'd built from 28 letters that it made her chest ache. "Daniel," she said. "Yeah." "Don't make me fall in love with you," she said. "Not yet. I'm not there yet. I need it to be slow." He didn't move. He didn't reach for her. He just looked at her with those dark, careful eyes and said, "All right. I mean it." "I know you do," he said. "I'm not in any hurry, Emily." She turned back to the oven. Her hands were shaking again, but not the way they had on that first doorstep. This was different. This was the shaking that came from saying a true thing out loud and having someone receive it without flinching. Thomas had loved her with noise and energy and an enormous, uncomplicated heart. She had loved him for it. She had needed it then, the loudness, the warmth, the way he took up space so completely that grief couldn't find room to get in. But she was a different woman now. She'd been made different by the quiet. And what Daniel Hayes offered her was something she hadn't known she needed until 8 months of letters had named it, someone who could sit in the silence with her and make it feel like enough. She was terrified of what that meant. The letter arrived on a Thursday, the one she hadn't written. She found it under her door at dawn. No envelope, no postage. Just a folded piece of paper with her name on the outside in the handwriting she knew better than her own. She stood in the doorway in her bare feet on the cold floorboards and read it right there. Emily. I am trying to be slow. I want you to know I understand why you need that, and I respect it more than I can say in a letter which is saying something given what I've managed in letters before. I've been thinking about what you said about Thomas, about the silence. I want to say you don't have to apologize for still loving him. You can love a man who's gone and still have room for something new. Those things aren't in competition. They're just both true at the same time. I reckon that's the hardest kind of truth, the kind where two opposite things have to live in the same house. But you're better at that than you think. D. She read it 4 times. Then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and pressed the letter flat against the wood and put her face in her hands. She was not crying. She told herself clearly that she was not crying, and then she cried for about 2 minutes into her palms very quietly, the way you cry when something has been hurting for a long time, and someone has finally carefully named the exact shape of it. She composed herself. She got out paper. She wrote back, Daniel 2, opposite things living in the same house. That's the finest description of grief I've ever read, and I've been trying to describe it to myself for 14 months. Thank you for that. And for leaving this under the door before I was awake so I could read it alone first. You understand more than you should about how I need things. I'm not sure if that's frightening or the best thing I've encountered in a long time. Possibly both. Emily. She folded it. She walked across the road and knocked. He answered the door with his coffee in hand, and she held out the letter, and he took it, and their fingers brushed, actually touched this time just for a second, and she walked back home without saying a word. She counted to 30 from her own porch, and then she heard him laugh. Low and real on the other side of the road. She went inside smiling in a way that hurt. Shocked, it was Ruth who saw the clouds first. Emily was at the store the following Saturday when Ruth came in from the back with a face that meant news. Not good news. The kind of face that preceded information a person was still assembling into meaning. Big storm coming, Ruth said. Jenkins up at the ridge said he saw the sky going green last night. Weather like this time of year? She paused. Emily, your garden. Emily felt it hit her before the words finished forming. The garden on the east side of the house, the kitchen garden, the herb beds, The rows of root vegetables she hadn't gotten up yet because the frost had held off and she'd been pushing her luck. The garden that made up a third of what she sold through the winter. The garden she and Thomas had planted together in their first spring here in the soil she'd amended every year since with her own hands. She left the store at a half run. She got home and looked at the sky, and Ruth hadn't been wrong. It had that color to it. The low, flat, greenish gray that meant something serious was coming, not just weather, but weather, the kind that had intention. She had maybe 2 hours to pull what she could. She grabbed the bushel baskets from the barn and started pulling carrots, her hands moving fast in the cold dirt. Not thinking, just working the way she'd learned to work after Thomas. Don't think, just move. Just keep your hands busy. She had the first row done when she heard boots on the road. She looked up. Daniel was already coming through the gate with a second basket and a short-handled spade, and he hadn't stopped to ask, and she hadn't stopped to invite him, and neither of them wasted 30 seconds on it. "East rows first," she said. "They flood soonest." "Show me." They moved through the garden like they'd done it before, passing tools, calling out, falling into a rhythm that had no wasted motion in it. The wind picked up. The temperature dropped. The first roll of thunder sounded somewhere in the direction of the ridge, low and serious. "Beets next," Emily said. "Then the herbs take the whole plant. I'll dry them inside." "Got it." The rain started 20 minutes in. Not gradual, not polite, just suddenly there, hard and cold and sideways. And Emily was soaked through her coat in under a minute, and she didn't stop and he didn't stop, and they worked through the downpour with the thunder getting closer and the garden going muddy and slick under their boots. She reached for the last row of carrots at the same time he did. Their hands landed on the same bunch. Neither of them moved for a second. The rain was coming down in sheets. The thunder cracked close enough to feel. They were both kneeling in the mud of her garden, soaked through hands on the same root vegetable, and it was nothing like any romantic moment she had ever imagined in her life, and it was the most she had felt in 14 months. She looked at him. He was already looking at her. His hair was plastered flat, and he had mud on his jaw, and he was looking at her like she was something he'd been trying to locate for a very long time. "Daniel," she said. "I know," he said. I said slow. "I'm not doing anything," he said. "I'm just looking at you, Emily." She pulled the carrots. She put them in the basket. She stood up. "We need to get the herbs inside," she said. "Yeah," he said. They finished the garden in the rain. They carried the baskets to the porch. They stood there dripping while the storm moved in full overhead, and Emily looked at all of it. The full baskets, the saved garden, the muddy man beside her who had run across the road without being asked, and she thought about what Ruth had said. "That man is in love with you." And she thought about what Daniel had written. Two opposite things living in the same house. And she thought about Thomas's barn door, and the biscuit dough, and the particular sound of a life going wrong without warning. She thought, "I am terrified." She thought, "I am still here." She thought, maybe those two things are the same. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee. You'll freeze out here." He followed her in. She was closing the door against the storm when she heard him say it very quietly under his breath, like he wasn't sure he meant to say it out loud. "I wrote you about this. Last April." She turned. "The rain," he said. I said that the thing I missed most wasn't the big things. It was having someone to come in out of the rain with." She remembered. She remembered reading that letter at the kitchen table with her second cup of tea and pressing her hand flat against the paper and thinking, "I know exactly what you mean." She remembered writing back, "I think that is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me," and dropping it in the post the next morning before she could take it back. She stood in the doorway of her own kitchen and looked at the man who had written her that letter, and he was soaking wet and muddy and completely painfully real. And the thing she'd been carrying for 14 months, the grief and the silence, and the held breath house, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. "I remember," she said. He nodded. He didn't push. He never pushed. She went to make coffee, and he sat down at the oak table, and the storm came down hard on the roof above them, and she thought two opposite things in the same house. She thought maybe that's not a problem to solve. Maybe that's just what living looks like after a while. She put his cup in front of him. He wrapped his hands around it. Outside, the lightning split the sky open, and Emily Carter stood in her kitchen with rain on her coat and mud on her boots, and something cracking open in her chest that she was finally cautiously starting to call by its right name. The storm lasted 2 days, not the rain. The rain cleared by Sunday morning, leaving the roads muddy and the creek running high and everything smelling like cold earth and pine. But the thing the storm had started inside Emily Carter lasted considerably longer than that, and she wasn't sure what to do with it except what she always did, which was keep her hands busy and her mouth shut, and hope clarity arrived on its own schedule. It didn't. What arrived instead on Monday morning was Margaret Perkins. Margaret Perkins was 60 years old, the wife of the hardware man, and the closest thing Willow Creek had to a town newspaper. She knew everything about everyone, and made no pretense of shame about it, which Emily had always privately respected, even when she was the subject. She arrived at the front door with a tin of shortbread cookies she'd clearly baked as an excuse, and she had barely crossed the threshold before she said, "So, the new neighbor." Emily put on coffee. "He helped me with the garden during the storm," Emily said in the flattest voice she owned. "He's a good neighbor. Margaret Aldridge says he comes by every morning. Margaret Aldridge runs a store. She sees a lot of things." "Emily." Margaret sat down at the table and folded her hands, the way a woman folds her hands when she's decided to be serious. "I'm not here to gossip. I'm here because you are my friend, and you have not looked like yourself in 2 years, and this morning you look—" She stopped, tilted her head. "You look like yourself again, and I want to know why." Emily poured 2 cups of coffee. She sat down. She looked at Margaret Perkins across the oak table and thought about how much of the truth was hers to tell and how much of it was Daniel's. "I'm all right," she said. "Better than I've been, that's all." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "He's a good man." "Yes," Emily said, without hesitation. Margaret nodded, picked up her coffee. "Then that's enough for me," she said. And to her considerable credit, she let it rest there. She stayed another 40 minutes and talked about her son's new farm in Nebraska, and the trouble with the schoolhouse roof and the price of winter wheat. And Emily listened and answered, and was grateful beyond words that Margaret Perkins was underneath all the curiosity genuinely a decent human being. After she left, Emily stood at the window and looked across the road. Daniel's horse was gone from the small paddock at the side of the house, which meant he was out. He'd mentioned something about checking the creek damage on the back end of his property, seeing what the storm had done to the fencing back there. She'd nodded and gone back to her bread and tried not to think about the fact that she'd tracked his daily movements well enough to know immediately when a horse was missing from a paddock. "You're not in any hurry," he'd said. She was starting to think she was in fact in a hurry. She was starting to think she was in a very significant hurry, and that the deliberate slowness she'd asked for was doing less to protect her than she'd intended, because there was apparently no speed at which Daniel Hayes could come into her life that wouldn't end with her feeling exactly like this. She put it away. She had bread to bake. She had orders to fill. She had a life that ran on schedule and required her attention, and she was going to pay it. She lasted until 2 in the afternoon before she wrote him a letter. Not about the storm. Not about Margaret Perkins or what was happening inside her chest. She wrote about something he'd mentioned once in letter number 12 about the ranch in Wyoming, where he'd worked the longest a spread outside of Laramie, and the way the cattle move before a storm. How they'd start drifting south a full day before the sky went bad. She'd been thinking about it during the storm, she said. She'd been thinking about how animals knew what was coming before the signs were visible, and whether people did the same thing, felt the pressure change in their bones, and started moving toward shelter without quite knowing why. She folded it. She walked to his door. She knocked. He wasn't back yet. She slid it under the door and went home. He knocked on her door at 7 that evening, with her letter in his hand, and a look on his face she hadn't seen before, not the careful steadiness, not the quiet attentiveness. This was something more direct, something that had made a decision. "I've been thinking about what you wrote," he said. "Come in," she said. He came in. He didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of her kitchen and looked at her and said, "The animals moving south before the storm. I think I understand what you're asking." "I wasn't asking anything," she said. "I was thinking out loud, in letter form. Emily." He said her name the way he had in the letters, not as a softening, not as a preface, as a complete sentence. "I moved here because of your letter." She went very still. "I had 3 other places I could have gone," he said. "Offers of work in 2 of them. I'd been looking at the Calloway place for 6 months, going back and forth. And then I got your letter about the apple blossom tree, and I wrote you back and didn't send it. And I thought, I am going to go be near whatever that is. I didn't know it was you specifically. I didn't know your face or your road or your name. I just—" He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. "I followed the letter." The room was absolutely silent. "You moved here," Emily said slowly, "because of a letter about a tree." "Because of what the tree meant," he said. "Because of who was writing about it." She sat down. Suddenly and without intention, she sat down in the kitchen chair like the knees went out of her. "Daniel," she said, "that is either the most romantic thing I've ever heard, or proof that we are both completely insane." He looked at her for a second. Then he laughed, the short, real surprised laugh she'd been collecting like currency since the first time she'd heard it. "Probably both," he said. "Probably both," she agreed. He sat down across from her. The table was between them, which felt necessary. Emily pressed both palms flat against the wood. The same grain, the same worn surface, the same oak table that had been there for every hard conversation she'd had in this kitchen. And thought Thomas. "I need to tell you something." "There's something I haven't said yet," she said. "All right. When I wrote to you in those first letters, I told myself it wasn't about loneliness. I had a whole system of names for what I was doing that didn't include the word lonely. I said it was correspondence. I said it was practical. I said it was just a woman with time in the evenings." She stopped. "But the truth is, I was so lonely, I didn't know where to put it anymore, after Thomas. The grief was manageable. I figured out grief. But the quiet afterward. The part where the grief gets quieter and you realize what's left isn't pain, it's just space. A lot of space where a person used to be. That I couldn't figure out." Daniel didn't move. He didn't fill the silence. He waited for her the way he always waited. "Your letters filled the space," she said. "And I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I was just using them to not feel the quiet. But it wasn't that. It was you were real in them. You were more real than most people I see face to face every week. And that mattered. That still matters." He leaned forward on the table, not toward her, just forward, like he was putting more of himself into the room. When Clara left, he said, "The thing that stayed with me wasn't the heartbreak. Heartbreak fades. The thing that stayed was the shame. That I had wanted something that didn't want me back, and that I hadn't seen it coming, and that I'd been building something in my head that was different from what was actually there." He looked at her. "I spent 3 years being very careful not to do that again, not to want something at a distance and mistake it for something real. And now," Emily said, "and now I'm sitting at your table," he said, "and it's not a distance anymore." Her breath left her body in a slow, complete way. "That's—" She started. Stopped. Started again. "That's exactly where we're different, because I'm afraid of the opposite. I spent 14 months being sure of who Thomas was, and then he was gone, and the certainty went with him. And now She pressed her hands harder against the table. "I'm afraid to be sure of anything again, because being sure means there's something to lose." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be sure. Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm asking if I can keep sitting at this table," he said. "That's all, for now." Emily looked at him across the wood and the lamp and the quiet of her kitchen, and she thought about the apple blossom tree out front, the one that held on past its season, the one she'd written about in October, the letter that had brought him here. She thought about stubbornness and hope, and how he'd said they were the same thing in different coats. "Yes," she said. "You can keep sitting at this table." He nodded. He stayed another hour. They talked about the creek damage, about her Friday orders, about a book she had on the shelf that he'd read years ago in a bunkhouse in Montana. The conversation moved the way water moves, finding its own level, taking the path with the least resistance. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. When he left, she stood at the door and watched him cross the road, and she thought, "I am in love with this man." She thought it clearly without flinching, and then she closed the door and went to bed. She slept the whole night through for the first time in 14 months. The complication arrived on a Wednesday the way complications in small towns always arrive, sideways and through someone else's mouth. She was at the general store when she heard it. Not directed at her, she was in the back near the flour sacks, and the two women near the front didn't know she was there. She recognized both voices. Carol Jessup and Ida Moore, who were pleasant enough individually and combustible together. "Moved into the Calloway place," Ida was saying. "No family, no connections here. Nobody knows where he came from." "Ruth Hadley says he's decent enough," Carol said, but her tone was the particular tone of a woman entertaining an objection she hasn't quite committed to. "Ruth Hadley is generous to a fault. I'm just saying Emily Carter is a widow on her own, and she's got property, and a man shows up out of nowhere and starts spending time at her house every morning. You think he's after her land?" "I think we don't know him," Ida said. "And she doesn't either, not really. Not enough." Emily stood very still between the flour sacks. She could walk out from the back and end the conversation, which would require pretending she hadn't heard the beginning. She could say nothing and listen to the rest. Or she could do what she actually did, which was pick up her flour and walk directly to the front of the store and set it on the counter and look at both of them with a face that her grandmother would have recognized. The silence was immediate and complete. "Ladies," she said. "Good morning." Carol went pink. Ida held her ground with the particular dignity of a woman who's been caught and has decided to own it. "Emily," Ida said. "We weren't—" "I know what you were doing," Emily said. Her voice was calm, level, the kind of calm that came from having held herself together through worse things than this. "And I understand it. You're worried. You think you're looking out for me. I've done the same for people I care about." She looked at both of them steadily. "Daniel Hayes is a man I know better than I've known most people I've met face to face," she said. "I can't explain the full shape of that right now, but I'm asking you to trust my judgment. I have run this property alone for over a year. I am not a naive woman." Ida opened her mouth. "And if I hear—" Emily continued quietly without heat, "that anyone in this town has made him feel unwelcome based on speculation, I will be very disappointed. He deserves the same good faith this town extends to anyone else." She paid for her flour. She said good morning. She left. She made it half a block before her hands started shaking. Not from anger. From the thing underneath the anger, the fear that they weren't entirely wrong. That she was moving too fast, feeling too much, trusting something built from paper and ink and 40 yards of dirt road. She'd told Daniel she was afraid of certainty. She hadn't told him she was afraid of looking like a fool. She hadn't told him that part of what kept her moving slowly was the awareness of how it looked from the outside. A widow, a property, a stranger with no local ties. She'd told herself she knew better. She did know better. But knowing better and feeling better were two different things. She went home. She put the flour away. She sat down. She pulled out a piece of paper. She wrote Daniel, "Someone in town today suggested you might be interested in my property rather than me. I'm telling you because I believe you deserve to know what's being said, and because I've been sitting here for 20 minutes trying to decide whether any part of me wonders if it's true, and I want to look at that honestly." She stopped, read it back. She wrote, "It's not true. I know it's not true, but I needed to write it down to be sure." She sat with that for a long moment. Then she wrote, "The things I'm afraid of are not about you. They're about me. I think that's important to say." She folded it. She put on her coat. She went across the road. He answered the door and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She handed him the letter. "Read it," she said. "I'll wait." He read it. She watched his face. While he did, watched the careful steadiness hold, watched something move beneath it. When he got to the middle, watched it settle into something quieter by the end. He looked up. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I needed you to know." "I know." He lowered the letter. "I also know what it looks like when a man with no local name moves near a widow with good land. I'm not blind to how that reads, and I can't do anything about what people choose to think." "I know that," she said, "but you needed to hear me say I understand it." She exhaled. "Yes," she said. "I did." He held the door open wider. "Come in. I'll make coffee this time." She came in. She sat at his table, plain and functional. Nothing like hers, but the same kind of solid. And she watched him move around the kitchen, and she thought about what Ruth had said about walls. About how in a letter there were none. She thought about the fact that she'd handed him her fear written out in her own handwriting, and he'd read it and offered her coffee, and held the door open. And that was everything. That was exactly the thing. He set the cup in front of her. He sat down. "In letter number 9, he said, you wrote that Thomas never made you feel foolish for the things you were afraid of. You said that was the thing you missed the most, someone who held your fears like they were reasonable." She remembered. She remembered writing that at midnight with cold feet and a lamp that kept guttering. "I remember," she said. "I'm not Thomas," he said. "I'll never be Thomas, and I don't want to be. But I want you to know that your fears are reasonable to me. All of them. The ones you've written and the ones you haven't yet." Emily wrapped both hands around the cup. "Daniel," she said. "Yeah. I'm going to say something, and I need you to not make a big thing of it." He waited. "I'm glad you followed the letter," she said. "I'm glad you came here. I'm glad it was you across the road." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply, "So am I, Emily. Every single day." She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside, the autumn afternoon was doing what Colorado afternoons did in October, going golden and cold and heartbreakingly clear. And Emily sat at a stranger's table that didn't feel like a stranger's anymore, and thought, "Thomas, I think I'm going to be all right." She thought it without guilt for the first time, without the feeling that being all right was a betrayal of something. She thought it like a fact, plain and simple, and finally quietly true. She was reaching for something she hadn't reached for in a very long time. And for the first time since the October morning everything went wrong, she didn't pull her hand back. She didn't tell him she loved him that week, or the next. Not because she didn't mean it. She meant it with a clarity that frightened her. But because Emily Carter had learned the hard way that the most important things deserved to be said at the right moment, not just the first available one. Thomas had taught her that without intending to. He'd said, "I love you" so often and so easily that the words had become like breathing, necessary, unconscious, never in doubt. She had loved him for it. But she understood now that there were different ways to say a thing, and some of them didn't use words at all. She said it in bread. In the sourdough loaf she left on his porch at 6 in the morning because she knew he was up before dawn, and she knew he didn't eat enough breakfast. She said it in the way she laughed at his jokes a half-second before they landed, because she knew the rhythm of how his mind worked. She said it in the way she stopped pretending she wasn't watching for his lights to come on across the road every morning. He said it back the same way. In fence posts and pheasants and coffee made exactly the way she took it, 2 sugars, no cream, without being asked. In the way he showed up on her porch with his tools on the same morning, she'd been thinking the barn door needed looking at, like the thought had crossed the road on its own. In the way he never pushed, never crowded, never made her feel like the pace she needed was an inconvenience. It was Ruth who finally said what everyone in Willow Creek had been saying for a month. "You two are the worst-kept secret in the county," she said on a Thursday afternoon in November, sorting mail with the focused air of a woman making an announcement she's been saving. "We're neighbors," Emily said. Emily. We're friends. Emily Ann Carter. Ruth set down an envelope and looked at her straight. That man turned down a foreman position in Pueblo last week. Did you know that? Emily went still. What? Henderson at the feed store has a cousin in Pueblo. The offer came through 2 weeks ago. Good money, winter work, a place to stay through spring. Ruth picked up the envelope again. He turned it down. He didn't tell me that, Emily said. No, Ruth said. He wouldn't. That's not the kind of man who tells you a thing like that. He just does it and says nothing and hopes you figure it out. Emily stood in the middle of the post office and thought about Daniel Hayes turning down a winter job 2 weeks ago without mentioning it. She thought about what that meant. She thought about the desk drawer and the unsent letter, and I followed the letter and every morning with coffee going cold between them at the kitchen table. She was out the door before Ruth finished the sentence she'd started. She didn't knock. She opened the gate and crossed his yard and knocked hard on the door, and when he opened it, she said, "Pueblo." He looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he stepped back and let her in. "Henderson's cousin," he said. "Yes." "That man cannot keep a confidence to save his life," Daniel said, and he said it with such mild, genuine resignation that she almost laughed. She didn't laugh. She crossed her arms and looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "Because it wasn't relevant. A foreman position in Pueblo isn't relevant." "Not to me," he said. "No." "Daniel. Emily." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to Pueblo. I wasn't going to Pueblo before Henderson's cousin said a word about it. I made that decision for my own reasons, and it didn't occur to me to announce it because it wasn't a hard decision. It took me about 4 minutes. 4 minutes, she repeated. Maybe 3, he said. She looked at him across the room and felt something shift in her chest. Not the cracking open feeling from the storm, not the slow warmth of the letters. This was something more solid, something that felt like ground. "You stayed for me," she said, not a question. He held her gaze. "I stayed for what this is," he said. "Whatever this is, yes." She crossed the room. She didn't touch him. She stopped just short, close enough that she had to look up to see his face, and she said very quietly, "I love you. I need you to know that before another week goes by where I don't say it." The room was completely silent. His expression moved through something she didn't have a name for, something wide and unprepared that he hadn't had time to make careful. She watched it move through him like weather. "Emily," he said. His voice had changed. It was rougher, lower. "I'm not asking you to say it back," she said. "I just needed to say it. Ruth would tell me that's the bravest thing and the most obvious thing, and that I should have done it 2 weeks ago, and she'd be right on all 3 counts." He reached out and took her hand. Just that her hand in both of his, the way he'd taken the pie tin on the first day, careful about it, like something he was aware could break. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying very hard to be slow about it the way you asked. But I have loved you since letter number 14, where you wrote that grief isn't loud, it's just the absence of someone's boots by the door. I read that, and I thought that woman understands something most people spend their whole lives missing. And I was already gone before I knew your face." She was not going to cry in his front room. She had decided this firmly, and it was completely irrelevant because her eyes were doing exactly what they wanted. "Letter 14, she said. "I cried writing that one." "I know," he said. "I could tell." She laughed. He pulled her in. She let him, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the middle of his half-finished house on a Thursday afternoon in November, while the wind came in off the ridge, and it was not a grand moment. It was not cinematic. It was just 2 people who had been carrying their separate weights for a long time, setting them down in the same place. That was enough. That was more than enough. So, he asked her to marry him in January. She hadn't expected January. She'd thought if she thought about it, which she tried not to, because thinking about it made her nervous. In a way she couldn't entirely justify. She'd thought it would take longer. A full year, maybe. Long enough for the town to stop watching them with that particular alert curiosity, long enough for her to stop flinching every time she felt happy, like happiness was something she had to earn back gradually. But it was January. And it was not a grand gesture. He'd come over for supper, something they'd started doing 3 nights a week without formally arranging it. The same way everything between them seemed to happen by mutual quiet agreement, and they'd eaten, and she'd been washing dishes, and he'd been drying them, which was a thing he did without being asked, which still undid her a little every time. He said, "Emily, do you want to build a life with me?" That was it. No ring, though the ring came later. No speech. No preparation. She kept washing the dish in her hand. She didn't look at him. "A real life," she said. "Not just across the road." "A real life," he said. "Here, together. Not perfect, but real and honest and ours." She put the dish in the rack. She turned around. She looked at the man who had followed a letter across 3 states and fixed her fence and saved her garden and turned down Pueblo and held her hand in his front room while she cried. And she thought about stubbornness and hope and different coats. And she thought about 2 opposite things in the same house. And she thought about the apple blossom tree that held on past its season. "Yes," she said. "I do." He cupped her face in both hands. Work rough, warm, steady as everything else about him, and he kissed her, and it was soft and certain and real, and nothing about it felt like a beginning, because it wasn't. It was a continuation. It was the same conversation they'd been having since February, moving through its natural next room. Well, the wedding was in March. Small and plain, the way both of them wanted the little church on the south end of Main Street. Ruth Hadley, weeping openly in the second pew. Margaret Perkins holding her hand with the satisfied expression of a woman who had always known it would come to this. The minister kept it short. The vows were the old ones, simple and absolute, the kind that didn't leave room for conditions. Ida Moore was in the back pew. She'd brought a casserole to the reception. Emily thanked her for it genuinely, because she was not a woman who held a grudge when the grudge had already made its point. Daniel said "I do" in the same voice. He said everything low and unhurried and completely without performance. And Emily said it back with her hands steady and her eyes clear, and that was that. That was the whole of it. Afterward, Ruth grabbed her arm in the church doorway and said very fiercely, for a woman who'd just been weeping, "You did it right. You did the whole thing right." "I was terrified the whole time," Emily said. "I know," Ruth said. "That's exactly what I mean." They didn't have a perfect life. Emily would have been suspicious of perfect, and Daniel had no interest in pretending. There were hard months one spring when the creek flooded for real. Not just threatened and took out the east fence and half the root vegetable beds, and Emily spent 3 weeks running on 4 hours of sleep and too much coffee, and she was not easy to be around, and she knew it, and she said so, and he said "I know" and stayed anyway. There were nights when she woke at 2 in the morning with Thomas's barn door in her head, the sound of that fall, the terrible specific sound of it, and she lay in the dark and breathed through it, and sometimes Daniel was awake beside her, and sometimes he wasn't, and either way, she was not alone with it anymore, and that made all the difference. There was the argument in their second year that was genuinely bad. Not a disagreement. An argument the kind with raised voices and a door that got closed harder than necessary. About money. About a decision she'd made without asking him, and a decision he'd made without asking her, and the way 2 independent people had to learn to be something else without losing what made them themselves. She said things she didn't mean. He went quiet in a way that was worse than words. They didn't speak for 2 days. He put a letter under her door on the 3rd morning. She read it at the kitchen table. It said, "I reckon we forgot for a minute that we built this on honesty. I'm sorry for my part in that. I'd like to come have coffee and talk like 2 people who know each other if you're willing. D." She went across the road and knocked. He opened the door. She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "So am I." They went inside and talked for 3 hours, and when they came out the other side of it, they knew each other better than they had. Going in, which was the thing a good argument could do if you let it. She was 35 when their first child was born. A girl dark-haired like Daniel, with Emily's stubbornness, and her grandmother's sharp mouth, which became apparent very early and never really softened. They named her Margaret Ruth, which made two women in Willow Creek simultaneously burst into tears for different reasons. 2 years later, a boy. Thomas Daniel, because some names were not about the past. They were about carrying something forward. The house across the road stayed in the family. They kept it for storage, then fixed it up, then rented it to a young schoolteacher who turned out to be excellent company, and became something like a little sister to Emily over the years, which was not something she had expected, and something she came to need. The baking business grew. It outgrew the kitchen, then outgrew the small space Emily rented from Mrs. Aldridge, and eventually, in their 6th year together, grew into something that required 2 ovens and a hired hand on Fridays. Daniel kept the property running, took on some of the land management work he was trained for, and turned out to have a particular gift for the kind of quiet, steady reliability that a working farm required. Willow Creek stopped watching them with curiosity. They became simply themselves, Emily and Daniel Hayes the baker, and her husband the couple in the White House on the far side of the creek road. People came to Emily for the bread and stayed for the conversation and left feeling fed in more than one sense. That was what she built. That was what she meant to build. One evening in November, their 9th year, the month they'd always thought of as theirs, the month of apple blossoms, letting go, and letters beginning, Emily was going through the box under the bed. She did this sometimes, not often. Once a year maybe when the mood was right and the house was quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed and read through them. His letters. Her letters, the unsent ones from both sides, and she felt the particular feeling of looking at something that had happened to younger people. People who had been afraid in ways she no longer was, who had circled around each other in the dark and found their way by feel. Daniel came in and saw what she had spread on the bed and didn't say anything. He just sat down beside her and picked up one of the letters, his own, the one about the held breath house, and read it. She watched his face. "Lord," he said, "I was lonely." "I know," she said. "I could tell when I read it." "That obvious." "Painfully," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You wrote back that same week." "I know," she said. "Draw your own conclusions." He laughed. She folded the letter and put it back in the box and closed the lid. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that while the house settled around them, the particular sound of a house with children sleeping in it, and a fire banked low, and a life that had been built out of 2 people deciding over and over that this was worth the risk. Then Emily got up and went to the living room. She came back with the dried apple blossom, the one she'd pressed between wax paper, the October before Daniel knocked on her door, the one from the tree that wouldn't let go, the one she'd framed 2 years ago and hung in the hall. She held it in both hands and looked at it. "I'm going to move this," she said. "I want it in here." "All right," Daniel said. "Where?" She looked at the wall across from the bed, the first wall she saw every morning when she woke up. She looked at it for a moment. "There," she said. "So, it's the first thing I see." He got up. He took the frame from her. He found the nail by feel in the dark, and didn't need a lamp, because he knew this room the way she knew it, the way you know a place that is genuinely yours, not by ownership, but by living. He hung it. He stepped back. They both looked at it, the small dried flower behind glass, pale and perfect, the thing that had held on past its season in the yard of a widow who didn't know yet that the stranger moving into the house across the road had already read her heart in a letter and come to find her. "You know what I think," Daniel said. "Tell me," Emily said. "I think that tree knew exactly what it was doing," he said. Emily looked at the blossom on the wall. She thought about a morning in late October, and a warm pie, and a dirt road, and a door opening, and the moment the whole shape of her life broke open and became something new. She thought about 31 letters, and 28 letters, and the ones in between that never got sent. She thought about 2 opposite things in the same house and how that wasn't a problem at all, how that was just what a full life looked like. She reached for his hand without looking. He took it without looking. "So do I," she said. And she meant it the way she meant everything that mattered, completely without conditions, with both feet on the ground and her eyes wide open. Some people spent their whole lives waiting for a grand moment to change everything. Emily Carter had learned the truth of it. The moment that changes everything is always a small one. A letter written at midnight. A pie carried across a road. A knock on a door by a woman with shaking hands who had no idea she was walking toward the rest of her life. She had been brave enough to cross that road. He had been brave enough to follow a letter. And every ordinary morning since coffee and bread and fence posts and children and arguments and letters and laughter and the long quiet nights had been proof that the smallest act of courage done at the right moment is enough. It is always enough.